Darkwing Duck asks, what's the closest distance between the number 1 and 8 seed in a conference's history? So I went back to 1984 here, just because that's when the NBA sort of, or not sort of, they did switch to the 8 teams per conference playoff format. I believe is when that happened. And I also believe the impetus for this question is we look at the East right now, and the eighth place Nets are 9 games back of the first place Heat, and that's fairly anomalous. You look at last year, there was a big difference in that in the Eastern Conference. We've seen a lot bigger. Like, there have been instances. I mean, look at this year in the West. The Clippers are 18 games back of the first place Suns in the West as the eighth place team. And so you look sort of at the East, and even with the 10th place Hawks being only 11 games out of first, and really, kind of diverting from the question, they're also only 6 games in the loss column back of the fourth place Cavaliers. There's a lot of tightly contested races going on here. But so I went through, I found 3 of the seasons that stood out the most to me. I did bounce the 98-99 campaign from consideration. I didn't need, because it was lockout truncated, I didn't need to bounce the 2011-2012 Crusade off the record because they didn't qualify. There was only a 6-game difference in the Eastern Conference or the Western Conference. I can't remember since I closed it out, between the 8th and the first seed. But again, that was across a 50-game season, so that didn't feel worth including. 2009-2010 is the winner here, technically. The 8th seeded Oklahoma City Thunder were 50-32 and 7 games back of the first place Los Angeles Lakers. The Spurs and the Blazers were also tied, with win losses, to the Oklahoma City Thunder. So those 3 teams, 6, 7, and 8, were all 7 games back. That's a wildly close margin when you're going that deep into the Western Conference. There's also the 2018-2019 season, more recently, the 8th place Los Angeles Clippers and also the 7th place Spurs, since they were both 48-34. They were 9 games back of the first place Warriors there. And then the 2002-2003 season, we were in the Eastern Conference this time. The Bucks were in 7th place and the Magic were in 8th place, both at 42-40. They were only 8 games back of the then first place Detroit Pistons. So 2009, 2010, that is the closest one on record where there was only a 7-game discrepancy from the 8th to the first seed. And it's wild when you contextualize it this way. It's still the same distance, but the Lakers winning 57 games as the 1 seed, and then the Thunder winning 50 games as the 8 seed. That is just so darn close. And then, of course, there's that huge drop off because the Thunder in 8th place were 8 games better than the 9th place Houston Rockets. So that was a fun question. I guess it'd be interesting to see whether the East could kind of come close to beating that. The Raptors are in 7th place, and they're 7 games back of the first place Miami Heat. The Nets, as I already mentioned, they're 9 games back. It's possible that they could close that gap just because if Kevin Durant comes back soon, if Kyrie Irving's eventually able to play in every game, do we know when Ben Simmons is going to play? Just what do they look like? I wouldn't put it past this season becoming sort of the new touchstone for, a small gap, but the smallest gap between the 1 and the 8 seed. And even if the records don't kind of show it, you just based off knowing what the Nets could look like at full strength, you could probably make the leap and say this is one of the most tightly contested Eastern Conference playoff races in history. Either way, though, even just going by that raw, games back in the standings total, this has a chance to really beat that 2009, 2010 mark. This could even be a situation technically where we're looking at it like it was 98, 99 when there was only 6 games separating the 8 seed from the 1 seed. I don't know if we'll get to that point, but it's making for one hell of a close to the season. And it's just, I'm more fascinated. I'm fascinated with every aspect of the Eastern Conference race just because there's no seed that's just locked down at this point. You also just have the 10th place Atlanta Hawks being, 6 losses behind the 4th place Cleveland Cavaliers. And there are just caveats abounding everywhere. The Bucks are in 5th. Are they actually going to stay there? And they have the same record as the Cavs. When does Brook Lopez play? What do some of their new additions look like? But Cleveland is dealing with a banged up Karis LeVert and Darius Garland, not to mention Colin Sexton's out for the season. The Bulls have some injuries in Caruso and Lonzo Ball. Zach LaVine is playing through a knee injury. The Heat are great, and they're finally they're the healthiest they've been all season. What do the Nets look like when they're healthier? Can the Raptors they're dealing with some stuff with OG and FVV right now, but are they too top heavy? Are they a team that could fall off? But I do look at these top 8 teams specifically, and I don't think you can assume that one is really going to plunge, and you really have to go deeper. Probably you have to look at the Raptors or the Nets just because the Celtics are in 6th and they're 5.5 games back of first place. And so I know I'm throwing a bunch of numbers here, but the Raptors and Nets are the 2 furthest teams at 7 and 9 games respectively off the first place pace. And there's like a real chance that both those teams, if they're healthy enough, are going to be good enough, get wins from enough good teams. Uh, they can bridge the gap to where they are only 5 or 6 games back of first. I haven't looked at the schedule, so I don't know if the win distribution can technically work out that way, but the East is a bloodbath right now. You can argue that the two most serious title contenders lie in the West with Phoenix and Golden State. As much as they're slumping, I think some people would make the leap and say Memphis might belong in that discussion. They're only 1 game back of second place in the West, by the way, entering March. That's fucking absurd. But this just underscores sort of how hot and heavy the East has been. Even if you like the top of the West better, there's more parity in the East right now, and the Grizzlies are a perfect case in point. They're 7 games back of the Suns, who are in first place. And that speaks more to the Suns, but that's part of the top heaviness. And meanwhile, we're talking about a Raptors team in 7th place is only 7 games back of the first place Heat. So this race has a chance to go down when you're looking at 1 through 8, again, specifically, has a chance to go down as the closest during the 16-team playoff format. I'm going to be very intrigued to see how it unfolds.